After a devastating accident, a ruthless businessman is left in a wheelchair, sinking into bitterness. Everything changes when three street children enter his life, bringing affection, faith, and the promise of a miracle. But as the transformation unfolds, a legal battle threatens to tear apart the new family they've built. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Continuing. The rain beat hard against the windows of the 32nd floor of the most modern corporate building on Park Avenue. Richard Thompson watched the city below, New York City pulsing in its frenetic routine, and felt the weight of the empire he had built with his own hands. At 43, he owned one of the largest construction firms in the country, had stakes in tech companies, luxury hotels, and even a supermarket chain that spanned 3 states. His name was always in the business pages of the newspapers, sometimes celebrated as a visionary, other times criticized for his aggressive negotiation tactics. Richard didn't care about the criticism. To him, business was war, and in war, there was no room for sentimentality. He fired employees without batting an eye when the numbers didn't meet expectations. He closed deals using legal loopholes that left smaller partners in delicate situations. He bought struggling companies for rock-bottom prices and dismantled them like someone taking apart an old toy. His philosophy was simple and direct. It's eat or be eaten. That Thursday afternoon, Richard had just closed another controversial deal. A family-owned custom furniture company, which had survived for 30 years in the market, had been absorbed into his group for a fraction of its real value. The former owners, an elderly couple who couldn't keep up with the industry's digital transformation, had signed the papers with tears in their eyes. Richard felt nothing but satisfaction for having secured such an advantageous price. Edward Morgan, his partner and right-hand man for over 10 years, entered the office with a bottle of imported whiskey and 2 crystal glasses. Edward was different from Richard in appearance, but similar in essence. Where Richard was direct and cold, Edward was smiling and calculating. His specialty was making people trust him before extracting what he needed. Together, they formed an unbeatable duo in the New York corporate world. He didn't know it yet, but that moment of celebration would be one of the last of Richard Thompson's old life. Fate, with its characteristic irony, was about to turn all of that man's certainties upside down. 2 hours later, Richard was driving his silver import along the FDR Drive toward his mansion on the Upper East Side. The traffic was as dense as ever, but he didn't mind. He turned on the car stereo and lost himself in thoughts about his next acquisition target. A chain of medical clinics was facing financial difficulties and would be perfect for diversifying his portfolio. The rain had stopped, but the road was still wet and slippery. Richard didn't see the truck that lost control a few yards ahead. He had no time to react when the heavy vehicle swerved across the lane and other cars began to brake sharply. The sound of twisting metal echoed along the expressway. Richard tried to swerve, but his reflex came too late. His car was hit on the side by another skidding vehicle, and the impact threw him against the guardrail with brutal force. The next few minutes were a blur of sirens, screams, and pain. A lot of pain. Richard heard voices around him but couldn't move. He felt his whole body ache, especially his back and legs. A strange sensation, as if something very heavy was pressing on his spine. He tried to move his feet but felt nothing. Panic began to take over, but soon darkness enveloped him. When he woke up, he was in a private hospital room. The white light from the ceiling hurt his eyes. Gradually, he began to recognize the faces around him. Edward was there with a worried expression that seemed genuine. There were doctors, nurses, and in the corner of the room, almost hidden behind everyone, was Helen. Helen Thompson, his wife of 15 years, was a beautiful 40-year-old woman who had learned to live in her husband's shadow. The daughter of a declining old-money New York family, she had married Richard when he was still building his empire. Attracted by the ambition and determination she saw in him. In the beginning there was love, or at least what they both believed was love. But over the years the marriage had become a cold, formal coexistence. Richard lived for business, came home late, traveled constantly. Helen had dedicated herself to charitable causes, art classes, and a social circle of women as lonely as she was. They looked at each other in that moment, husband and wife, and for an instant, Richard saw something in her eyes that he couldn't quite decipher. Concern, yes, but also an old sadness, as if this accident were just another chapter in a story already fated for melancholy. The lead doctor, a renowned neurosurgeon named Dr. Evans, explained the situation with as much delicacy as possible, but without hiding its gravity. The accident had caused a serious spinal cord injury. Richard had undergone emergency surgery that stabilized his spine, but the prognosis was uncertain. At the moment, he had no movement in his legs. There was a possibility of partial recovery with intensive physical therapy, but there was also a chance the paralysis would be permanent. Richard listened to everything in silence, processing the information as if it were data from a business report. But when he was alone in the room, reality crashed down on him with the weight of a mountain. He, who had always controlled everyone and everything around him, was trapped in a body that wouldn't obey his commands. The legs that had carried him to so many places, that had climbed ladders of success, that had stepped on so many competitors, were now two inert masses under the hospital sheet. The days in the hospital were a silent torture. Physical therapists came daily, trying to stimulate his muscles, moving his legs passively, looking for any sign of a nervous response. Richard cooperated mechanically, but inside he felt a growing rage. Rage at the truck driver who caused the accident, rage at the other drivers, rage at fate, rage at himself. Edward visited every day, bringing reports and documents to be signed. Business continued, and Richard tried to stay in control, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to concentrate. Helen came too, but she stayed for short periods. She would sit in the chair next to the bed, flip through magazines, make vague comments about the weather or some unimportant news. The distance between them, already vast before, seemed to have become an impassable chasm. After 3 weeks, Richard was discharged. He would return home in a wheelchair, with a nursing team for basic care and a physical therapist who would come 3 times a week. The necessary modifications to the mansion were already being made. Edward had taken care of everything efficiently. The mansion on the Upper East Side was a modern 3-story palace with immense gardens, a swimming pool, a tennis court, and a garage that could hold 8 vehicles. Richard had always been proud of that property, the ultimate symbol of his victory over life. Now, being wheeled inside, he felt that the huge house was a gilded cage. Helen hired more staff and reorganized the ground floor so that Richard would have access to everything he needed. A bedroom was converted into an accessible suite with a special bathroom and support equipment. The library became a physical therapy room. Everything was very efficient, very cold. Weeks turned into months. Richard began to refuse visits from friends and acquaintances. He didn't want them to see the great Richard Thompson reduced to this condition. Edward continued to come regularly, bringing papers to sign, but even these visits started to bother him. Richard realized he was losing real control of the business. Decisions were made by Edward and merely rubber-stamped by him. His signature was necessary, but his opinion less and less so. Helen had also changed, or perhaps he had just never really paid attention to her. His wife had become more distant, more mechanical in her care. She checked if he had taken his medicine, if the physical therapist had arrived, if the food was adequate. But there was no warmth, no connection. They slept on the same floor but in separate rooms. When they met, at meals, they talked about trivialities or simply ate in silence. Bitterness began to settle in Richard's soul like a weed that grows and suffocates everything around it. He, who had always been active, dominant, master of his own destiny, now depended on others for even the most basic tasks. The physical therapy showed no significant progress. There were days when he swore he could feel a slight tingling in his feet, but the doctors said it could just be his imagination, the brain trying to create sensations that no longer existed. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 4 months after the accident, that everything began to change. Richard was in the backyard near the wall that separated the property from the street. Helen had gone out to a charity event, and the staff were busy with their tasks. He was just sitting there, watching the plants, trying to find some meaning in his new limited existence. That's when he heard voices from the other side of the wall. children's voices, laughing and talking. Richard frowned, annoyed by the invasion of his peace. The sound was coming from a small hole at the base of the wall, a flaw in the structure he had never noticed before. Suddenly, 3 small faces appeared through the hole, 3 dirty, thin boys with torn clothes and hopeful expressions. The oldest, who must have been about 12, was the first to speak. "Mister, do you have any food you could give us? We're really hungry." Richard observed them coldly. Even in a wheelchair, even in his condition, his first impulse was contempt. Street kids, beggars invading his property. He was about to shout for a staff member when something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the 3 of them looked at him without fear, just with genuine hope. Or maybe it was the fact that for the first time in months he felt in control of a situation, however small. "You want food?" he asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "Yes, sir. We haven't eaten since yesterday." The oldest one smiled, revealing white teeth that contrasted with his dirty face. Richard should have sent them away. He should have called security. But something in that moment, in the loneliness of that afternoon, in the bitterness that corroded his chest, caused a dark and yet absurdly tempting idea to surface in his mind. "Come through there," he said, pointing to the hole in the wall, "and come over here." The 3 boys looked at each other, surprised but hopeful, and began to squeeze through the hole. The oldest came first, followed by a slightly smaller boy with large, expressive eyes, and finally a tiny boy who couldn't have been more than 8, and wore a small crucifix around his neck. When the 3 stood before him, dirty and barefoot but standing tall, Richard examined them with his usual calculating gaze. They were street kids, no doubt, probably orphans or abandoned, living on scraps and charity. In another life, Richard would have passed them by without even noticing. Now here he was, face to face with 3 human beings who had absolutely nothing but still found the strength to smile. "What are your names?" he asked. "I'm Leo," said the oldest. "This here is Matthew," he pointed to the middle one, "and the little one is Gabriel." Richard nodded, processing the information as if he were in a business meeting. Then, in a display of his old coldness, now seasoned with the bitterness of his condition, he made a proposal that would change all of their lives. "You want food? You want a home? You want a better life?" The 3 nodded vigorously, their eyes shining with hope. "Then make me walk again," Richard said, his voice laden with a mix of challenge, mockery, and hidden desperation. "If you can get me out of this wheelchair and walking again, I promise I'll adopt all 3 of you. I'll give you a home, food, education, everything, but only if I walk again. If you can't, I'll just feed you while you try and then you'll leave. Do you accept the challenge?" The silence that followed was heavy. Richard expected the children to laugh or be confused or simply run away from this crazy man. But Leo, the oldest, took a step forward and extended his dirty hand to Richard. "We accept, yes, sir. We're going to make you walk again. I swear." Matthew and Gabriel came closer too, their eyes filled with a determination Richard hadn't expected to see. Little Gabriel held his crucifix and said in a soft voice, "God will help us. You will walk, sir." Richard shook Leo's hand, feeling the boy's rough, calloused palm against his own hand, which had once been tough from controlling businesses, but was now soft from inactivity. In that handshake, a pact was sealed that none of the 4 yet fully understood. "You can stay in the back room while you try," Richard said, pointing to an outbuilding next to the main house that was once used to store garden tools. "I'll have the place prepared and food brought. But let's be clear, if I'm not walking in 6 months, our arrangement ends and you leave. Understood?" "Understood," the 3 said in unison. Richard called for the head housekeeper, Mrs. Celia, a 60-year-old woman who had worked at the house for over a decade. The shock on her face at seeing the 3 dirty children was visible, but Richard gave no detailed explanation. He ordered her to prepare the back room, arrange for clean clothes for the boys, and serve them a full meal. Mrs. Celia, always discreet and obedient, nodded and took the 3 inside. Richard remained there in the garden, looking at the empty space where the boys had stood moments before. What had he just done? What crazy impulse had led him to accept 3 street kids into his home with An absurd promise of adoption if they made him walk. Maybe it was the loneliness, maybe it was desperation disguised as a challenge, or maybe, deep in his hardened soul, there was still a spark of humanity he himself was unaware of. Whatever the reason, the decision was made. The die was cast. When Helen returned from the event that night and learned of the boy's presence, her reaction was one of surprise and restrained irritation. "Richard, what were you thinking? Bringing these children into our home, this is madness." Richard faced her from his chair, and for the first time in months he felt a shadow of his former authority. "It's temporary. They're going to try to help me with my physical therapy. If it works, great. If not, they'll leave. Simple as that." But that wasn't the whole truth, and they both knew it. Helen sighed, too tired to argue, and went to her room. She made it clear she would not get involved with those children. They were Richard's problem, and he could deal with the consequences. That night, as he lay in his modified bed, Richard looked at the ceiling and wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life, or if, by some miracle he didn't understand, he had just made the best decision. Time would tell. In the back room, newly cleaned and warm, 3 boys slept in real beds for the first time in a long time. Leo, the oldest, kept his eyes open the longest, processing everything that had happened that extraordinary day. Matthew and Gabriel were already fast asleep, exhausted but full and safe. Leo looked out the window toward the imposing mansion and made a silent promise. He didn't know how, he had no medical knowledge, he had no idea how to heal someone who couldn't feel their own legs. But he would find a way, he had to. This was their chance, perhaps their only chance, to have a different life. And he wouldn't let it slip away. Outside, the city of New York remained alive in the night, with its infinite lights and its millions of intertwined stories. In a corner of the Upper East Side, inside a luxurious mansion, a bitter businessman and 3 hopeful children had just begun a journey none of them could have predicted. A journey that would test not only the medical possibility of healing, but the human capacity for transformation, forgiveness, and love. The first day was over. The coming months would be a true test for everyone. The first rays of sun entered through the windows of the back room as Leo opened his eyes. For a moment he felt confused, not recognizing where he was. The mattress was too soft, the sheets smelled of lavender, and there was a roof over his head without leaks or holes. Then the memory came back like a wave. The mansion, the man in the wheelchair, the impossible promise they had made. Leo sat up in bed and looked at his companions. Matthew was snoring softly, wrapped in the blanket like a silkworm in its cocoon. Gabriel, the smallest, was sleeping on his stomach with the crucifix still around his neck, his dark hair spread across the pillow. How long had it been since they had slept like this, in peace and safety? The door opened, and Mrs. Celia entered carrying a tray with breakfast. Warm bread rolls, butter, jam, chocolate milk, and fruit. The smell woke Matthew and Gabriel immediately. "Good morning, boys. Have your breakfast before it gets cold. Then you'll take a proper shower and put on these clean clothes I've set out," she said, pointing to 3 piles of clothes on a chair. Her voice was firm but not cruel, the voice of someone who had a job to do and would do it well, regardless of her personal opinions. The 3 ate in silence, still processing the reality they had woken up to. Leo watched everything attentively, memorizing every detail. He had learned on the streets that nothing was permanent, that any moment of comfort could be snatched away without warning. He needed to be prepared. After showering and dressed in clean clothes that were too big for their thin bodies, the 3 were taken to the physical therapy room, where Richard was already waiting for them. The businessman was sitting in his wheelchair with a closed, distant expression. Next to him was a tall man in a white coat who introduced himself as Dr. Philip, the physical therapist. "So you're the miracle workers," Richard said with a tone of mockery. "Dr. Philip here has been working with me for months and hasn't managed to make me feel even a toe. But who knows, maybe you, with no training at all, can do the impossible." The sarcasm was evident, but Leo didn't let it get to him. He approached and asked the doctor, with a politeness that surprised everyone, "Sir, could you teach us what you do? We want to learn so we can help." Dr. Philip looked at Richard, who shrugged, and then at the boys. There was something in the determination of those childish eyes that touched him. "All right, I'll show you the basic exercises. But understand that this takes time and might not work." During the following session, the three boys watched every movement the physical therapist made with rapt attention. Leo asked questions constantly, wanting to understand the reason for each exercise. Matthew, quieter, observed the subtle details, the pressure applied, the angle of the movements. Gabriel simply held Richard's hand with his small hand and prayed softly. Richard, initially annoyed by the children's presence, began to get distracted watching them. It was strange to have these small, dirty beings, now clean but still fragile, dedicating so much attention to him. No one, not Helen, not Edward, not his staff, looked at him that way, as if he truly mattered not for his money or power, but simply for being a human being. The days began to follow a routine. In the morning, Dr. Philip would come for the official physical therapy session. The boys would watch and learn. In the afternoon, when the professional left, it was their turn to try to reproduce the exercises. Leo took the lead in massaging and moving Richard's legs. He had strong hands for a 12-year-old, hands calloused from carrying heavy things and doing odd jobs on the streets. Matthew, the middle one, discovered he had a natural gift for conversation. While Leo worked, Matthew would sit next to Richard and just talk. He told stories from the street, but not sad ones. He talked about the friends they made, the small adventures, the moments of kindness they found amidst the urban chaos. He spoke of forgiveness, of second chances, of how people could change. At first, Richard listened with disdain, making sarcastic comments. But as the days went by, he realized he was actually listening, sometimes even asking questions. Matthew was only 10, but he spoke with a wisdom that seemed to come from many lifetimes. Gabriel, the youngest, was different from the other two. He didn't try to do physical therapy and wasn't a great conversationalist. But every day, without fail, he would kneel beside Richard's chair and pray. He prayed aloud, in his clear, childish voice, asking God to perform a miracle, to return movement to the man who had given them shelter. Richard, who had never been religious, who had built his empire believing only in the strength of his own will, felt uncomfortable with these prayers. Several times he told the boy to stop, but Gabriel continued, unshakable in his faith. A week passed, then two. The routine was established. The boys also helped in the garden, under the supervision of the gardener, a Japanese gentleman named Mr. Takeshi, who had worked on the property for years. They learned to prune, plant, water. The physical work kept them busy and useful, and little by little the staff grew accustomed to their presence. Mrs. Celia especially began to soften. She saw how the boys ate, with a hunger that went beyond the physical, as if they were trying to fill years of deprivation. She started preparing extra portions, leaving sweets hidden in their rooms, checking if they were warm on cold nights. Helen observed everything from a distance, with a mixture of curiosity and resistance. She didn't approach the boys, maintaining her polite but cold distance, but sometimes Richard would catch her watching from the window when the boys played in the garden, and there was something in her gaze that he couldn't quite decipher. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the boys' arrival, that Edward Morgan showed up for his regular visit. He arrived with his Italian leather briefcase full of documents and his perfectly calibrated professional smile. But upon seeing the 3 children in the garden, his smile faltered. "Richard, what's this I hear about you housing street kids here?" Edward asked when they were alone in the office. Richard briefly explained the arrangement. Edward listened with growing disbelief and, Richard noticed, with something that seemed like genuine disapproval mixed with another emotion he couldn't identify. "This is madness, Richard. You don't know these children. They could be dangerous. They could steal. They could bring trouble. And this promise of adoption? You're emotionally vulnerable. You shouldn't be making decisions like this." Richard felt an irritation grow inside him. Since when did Edward care so much about his personal well-being? They were partners, not close friends, and there was something in Edward's tone that sounded false, as if he were reciting a script. "I know what I'm doing," Richard said coldly. "And if it bothers you, that's your problem." Edward backed off, realizing he had gone too far. "Sorry, it's just that I worry about you. We've been partners for so long. I just don't want to see you being taken advantage of." They then moved on to business. Edward brought several documents for signature, quickly explaining each one: property transfers, new contracts, authorization for asset sales. Richard signed mechanically, trusting his partner as he always had. But for the first time, a small seed of doubt was planted in his mind. Was he signing everything without questioning it enough? After Edward left, Richard stayed alone in the office for a long time. He looked around at the diplomas on the wall, the photos of inaugurations and awards, the symbols of his successful life. It all seemed distant now, as if it belonged to another person in another life. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Leo entered, hesitant. "Mr. Richard, it's time. For the afternoon physical therapy. Can we start?" Richard nodded and followed the boy back to the therapy room. There the three were already waiting for him. Leo with his strong hands ready to work, Matthew with his stories ready to distract, Gabriel with his prayers ready to ask. As Leo massaged his legs, working the muscles with impressive dedication for someone so young, Richard found himself thinking about how strange the situation was. Three boys who had nothing, who should have been focused only on survival, were dedicating hours every day trying to help him. Not out of obligation, not out of fear, but because they genuinely wanted him to get better. "Mr. Richard," Matthew began in his soft voice, "can I ask you something?" "You can. Were you always like this? Like, always working so much and not having time for other things?" Richard considered the question. Coming from an adult, it would have sounded like criticism or meddling. But coming from this 10-year-old boy, it sounded like genuine curiosity. "I always worked a lot, yes. I built all this with my own hands. I didn't have time for weakness or sentimentality. And was it worth it?" Matthew asked with an innocence that disarmed any defense. The question hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Richard didn't answer. He didn't know how to answer. Was it worth building an empire if he was now alone in a wheelchair, with no one who truly cared about him besides children he had known for only 3 weeks? Gabriel, who was kneeling in the corner as always, finished his prayer and approached. He placed his small hand on Richard's and said with absolute conviction, "God is going to heal you, sir. I know he will, but you also need to heal. On the inside." "What do you mean by that, boy?" Gabriel tilted his head, thoughtful. "My grandma, before she went to heaven, told me that sometimes we get sick on the outside because we're sick on the inside. That sadness and anger can make the body heavy. She said we need to forgive to become light again." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. Forgive whom? Forgive what? "I don't know. You're the one who knows. But I think there's a lot of heavy stuff inside you. You can see it in your eyes." The wisdom of this 8-year-old boy was unsettling. Richard pulled his hand away abruptly. "Enough philosophical talk. Get on with the exercises." The boys obeyed, but Richard found that Gabriel's words echoed in his mind for the rest of the day. That evening, during dinner, something unprecedented happened. Helen, who usually ate in silence or in her room, asked about the boys. "Are they behaving well?" Richard, surprised by the question, replied, "Yes, they work hard. They're doing what they promised." "And do you really think they can help you?" Her voice had something different, perhaps the beginning of genuine curiosity. "I don't know. Probably not. But at least they're trying." Richard paused, then added something that surprised him to say, "It's more than most people do." Helen looked at him for a long moment, and in that gaze was a recognition of a shared truth. They both knew he was talking about her too, about the chasm between them, about the loneliness they shared even while under the same roof. "Maybe I should get to know them better," Helen said softly, more to herself than to him. "Do what you want," Richard replied, turning his attention back to his food. But inside him something had shifted. A small door, closed for so long, had creaked open. The days continued to pass. The physical therapy sessions became a natural part of the routine. Leo developed his techniques, watching videos on the old phone Mrs. Celia lent him, looking for information on spinal rehabilitation. Matthew continued his conversations, but now Richard participated more, sometimes even telling stories from his own childhood, things he hadn't thought about in decades. Gabriel maintained his daily prayers, but now Richard no longer told him to stop. He simply let the boy perform his ritual, and strangely, those moments of prayer began to bring a certain peace to the room. It was on a Thursday, exactly 1 month after the boy's arrival, that Helen appeared in the physical therapy room. The four of them stopped and looked at her, surprised. "May I watch?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "You may," Richard replied, equally uncertain about what it meant. Helen pulled up a chair and sat down. She watched in silence as Leo worked on Richard's legs. She watched Matthew talk about hope and new beginnings. She watched Gabriel pray with his unwavering faith. When they finished, she approached the boys. Leo stood up, a little intimidated by the presence of this elegant woman. "You are very dedicated," she said softly. "How did you learn to do this?" Leo explained about the observations, the videos, the trial and error. Matthew spoke about the importance of keeping a positive mindset. Gabriel simply showed his crucifix and said that God guided them. Something in Helen's face changed. She knelt to be at Gabriel's level and asked, "Do you really believe it will work?" "I do, Ma'am. God works miracles. We just need to have faith and work with him." Unexpected tears filled Helen's eyes. She gently touched the boy's face and whispered, "I wish I had faith like that." From that day on, Helen started appearing more often, first just to observe, then to talk with the boys. She discovered that Matthew liked to draw and brought him art supplies she had stored away. She discovered that Gabriel loved Bible stories and began reading them to him at night. She discovered that Leo dreamed of learning to read better and offered to teach him. The house began to change. The cold, empty atmosphere was gradually filled with children's voices, laughter, and small moments of connection. The staff noticed the difference. Mrs. Celia commented to Mr. Takeshi that the mansion felt more alive than it had in all the years she'd worked there. Richard felt the change too, though he was reluctant to admit it. The conversations with Matthew made him think about his life choices. Leo's massages, done with such care, showed a form of dedication he had rarely encountered in the corporate world. Gabriel's prayers, initially irritating, had become strangely comforting. But it was Edward who first noticed the real change in Richard. On one of his visits about 6 weeks after the boys' arrival, he brought important documents to be signed. Contracts for a merger with another company, significant asset transfers. Richard, for the first time, read everything carefully before signing. He asked questions. He questioned details. Edward, accustomed to the automatic agreement of the past few months, became visibly uncomfortable. "Is there a problem with the documents?" Edward asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "I just want to understand everything properly. After all, these are important decisions." Edward forced a smile. Of course. It's just that you've always trusted me before. And I still do. But it doesn't hurt to check, does it?" Something flashed across Edward's face, a flicker of irritation quickly disguised. "Of course not. Feel free to review everything." After Edward left, Richard stared at the documents. Something was wrong, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. It was just a feeling, an instinct that was beginning to awaken after months of emotional numbness. Leo entered the room at that moment, bringing a glass of fresh juice that Mrs. Celia had prepared. "Mr. Richard, that man who came today, is he your friend?" "He's my partner." "Why?" Leo hesitated, biting his lip. "It's just that he looks at you in a strange way, like how people on the street looked when they wanted to rob us but were pretending to be nice." Richard was taken aback by the observation. Street kids developed a sharp instinct for danger, and Leo had survived 12 years in that world. Perhaps his instinct was picking up on something that Richard, in his vulnerability, wasn't seeing. "I'll be careful," Richard said, and for the first time in months, he felt a flicker of his old self. The calculating businessman, the man who was not easily fooled. That night, for the first time since the accident, Richard and Helen had dinner together and truly talked. They spoke about the boys, about how they had changed the dynamic of the house. Helen confessed that she had never felt so alive, so needed. "I always wanted to be a mother," she said softly. "But you were always so busy, and then it seemed too late, and then we just gave up on the idea without ever really talking about it." Richard listened to her, truly listened, and for the first time, he understood the emptiness she carried. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words came out sincere. "I'm sorry I didn't pay attention, that I didn't see you." Helen wiped away a tear and smiled. "Maybe it's not too late for anything." That night marked a subtle but profound change. The couple who had lived like strangers for years began to find their way back to each other, guided by 3 children who had come into their lives through a hole in the wall. And meanwhile, in the shadows, Edward Morgan planned his next moves. He had noticed the change in Richard, the new vigilance, the reawakening of his old shrewdness, and that was a problem, a big problem that needed to be dealt with quickly. The New York winter arrived with its cold mornings and grey skies. 2 months had passed since the boys' arrival, and the mansion on the Upper East Side had a completely different atmosphere. The corridors that once echoed only the hurried steps of staff now carried children's laughter, lively conversations, and even occasional music when Helen played the piano for the boys. Leo had become a dedicated student. Every morning before the physical therapy sessions, Helen taught him English, math, history. The boy absorbed knowledge like a dry sponge finally finding water. He discovered he loved numbers, that he had a knack for solving complex problems. Helen commented to Richard that the boy had the potential to go far, perhaps even into engineering, if he had the right opportunities. Matthew revealed a surprising talent for the arts. His drawings started simple but quickly evolved into impressive sketches. Helen converted a small studio at the back of the house, which had previously been filled with junk, into a creative space for him. She brought paints, canvases, art books. The boy would spend hours there, creating works that expressed both the pain of his past and the hope of his present. Gabriel, the youngest, continued with his unwavering faith. Helen enrolled him in catechism at the local church, accompanying him personally every Sunday. The priest, upon learning the boy's story, was deeply touched. Gabriel had a spiritual purity that moved everyone who knew him. His daily prayers for Richard became a sacred ritual in the house. Richard watched all of this from his wheelchair with mixed feelings. On one hand, he still felt no significant progress in his legs. There were days he swore he could feel a slight tingling, but the doctors remained skeptical, saying it was just wishful thinking projected by his brain. On the other hand, something was definitely changing inside him. The bitterness was beginning to give way to a strange and uncomfortable tenderness. The physical therapy sessions continued religiously. Leo applied the techniques with growing skill. Dr. Philip, on his weekly visits, admitted he was impressed with the boy's dedication. Sometimes he would leave study materials for Leo to read, explanations of anatomy and neurology, and the boy devoured it all. It was on a cloudy Tuesday in July that Edward Morgan appeared with a proposal that would change everything. He arrived in the middle of the afternoon unannounced, which was unusual. He usually called first. Richard was in the library with Helen and the boys when Edward walked in. "Richard, we need to talk. It's urgent," he said, casting a suspicious glance at the children. "You can speak here." Edward hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "It's about the business, confidential matters." Richard sighed and asked Helen to take the boys to the garden. When they were alone, Edward began to lay out a complex proposal, a merger with an international company that would require a complete restructuring of the company's assets, property transfers, liquidation of some investments, consolidation of others. "This will strengthen our market position exponentially," Edward explained, spreading documents across the table. "But it needs to be done quickly. The window of opportunity is short." Richard read the documents with renewed attention. There was something in them that didn't quite fit, but it was subtle, hidden amidst legal jargon and numbers. "I need time to analyze all of this carefully." Edward forced a smile. "Of course, but we don't have much time. The offer expires in 48 hours. Then I'll analyze it in the next 48 hours. The tension in the air was palpable. Edward packed up the documents, clearly dissatisfied. As he prepared to leave, His eyes fell on an antique clock on the library mantelpiece. It was a valuable piece, a Patek Philippe that Richard had bought at an auction years ago. It was easily worth $200,000. "Beautiful clock," Edward commented casually. "It was one of my first big luxuries," Richard replied, not paying much attention. Edward left soon after, but Richard noticed something strange. His partner seemed agitated, restless in a way that was not characteristic of him, and that look at the clock had been too intense to be just casual admiration. That night, Richard asked Helen to review the documents with him. She had a degree in business administration, although she had never formally worked. Together, they spent hours dissecting every clause, every proposed transfer, and they began to find inconsistencies. "Richard, look at this." Helen pointed to a specific section. "This asset transfer is structured in a way that you lose majority control. If this is approved, Edward gains decision-making power over everything." Richard felt his blood run cold. How had he not seen this before? Because he had trusted blindly, because he was vulnerable, because Edward had taken advantage of his condition. "I need to check the documents I've signed in recent months," Richard said, feeling a rising anger. "I want all the contracts, all the transfers." Helen went to get the file folders. They spent the entire night reviewing them, and what they discovered was shocking. Edward had structured a series of transactions that gradually transferred control and properties. It wasn't obvious in each individual document, but seen together it was a systematic takeover. Richard felt a mixture of fury and betrayal. Edward, his partner of 10 years, the man he had trusted like a brother, was stealing his empire while he was trapped in a wheelchair. But they still needed more concrete proof. Richard decided to play a dangerous game. He would pretend not to have discovered anything and sign the documents, but first, he would ensure all the evidence was documented and protected. He would call his personal lawyers, those who had no connection to Edward. The next day, Wednesday, Edward returned, anxious for the signed documents. Richard said he needed one more day. The frustration on Edward's face was evident, but he agreed. He left the mansion in a hurry without his usual pleasantries. It was on that same day, that fateful afternoon, that the situation exploded in a way no one expected. Leo was in the garden with Matthew and Gabriel, helping Mr. Takeshi prune the rose bushes, when Edward returned unexpectedly. He told Mrs. Celia he had forgotten an important document and needed to quickly go into the library. The housekeeper, suspecting nothing, let him pass. Edward went straight to the library, but not to get documents. With swift, precise movements, he took the Patek Philippe clock from the mantelpiece and, in a gesture that would be his downfall, walked out to the garden where Leo was. "Boy, come here a moment," Edward called with a false smile. Leo, always polite, approached. Edward, pretending to adjust something on the boy's shirt, slipped the clock into the pocket of the large coat Leo was wearing. The boy, distracted talking with Gabriel, didn't notice. Edward then went back inside the house and straight to the office where Richard was working. He entered without knocking, with a theatrical expression of shock. "Richard, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this, but I just saw one of the boys leaving the library with something in his hands. I think you should check if everything is in its place." Richard's heart sank. No, the boys wouldn't do that. But a part of him, the cynical part that had lived so many years in the cruel world of business, whispered doubts. Had he been naive? Was Edward right all along? "Let's check," Richard said, his voice tense. They called everyone into the living room, Mrs. Celia, Mr. Takeshi, Helen, and the 3 boys. Edward explained that the clock from the library had disappeared and they needed to do a check. Leo was confused. "A clock? I didn't take any clock." Edward sighed with false sadness. "No one is accusing anyone yet, but it would be good if everyone emptied their pockets just to be sure." The staff did so first, obviously with nothing. Helen watched in horror, already sensing where this was going. The boys began to empty their pockets. Matthew had only a few colored pencils. Gabriel had his crucifix and a holy card. And Leo, when he put his hand into the deep pocket of his coat, felt something cold and heavy. He pulled out the object without understanding. It was the clock. The damn clock he had never seen before in his life was there, in his pocket. The silence in the room was deafening. Edward put on an expression of false compassion. "Leo, why did you do this? After everything Richard has done for you?" "I didn't do anything," Leo shouted, tears starting to stream down his face. "I don't know how this got in my pocket. I swear, Mr. Richard, I would never steal from you. Never." Matthew and Gabriel ran to their older brother, all three, now crying. "Mr. Richard, Leo doesn't steal, he takes care of us, he's good," Matthew pleaded. Richard looked at the three boys, then at the clock, then at Edward. Something wasn't right. Leo didn't look guilty. He looked genuinely shocked and betrayed. And Edward was trying to look sad, but there was a glint in his eyes, a poorly concealed satisfaction. It was Helen who had the life-saving idea. "Richard, you have security cameras all over the house. Let's check the recordings." Edward visibly paled. "I don't think that's necessary. The boy clearly—" "We're going to watch the recordings," Richard interrupted, his voice as cold as steel. "Now." Mrs. Celia went to get the laptop connected to the security system. Richard, with hands trembling from suppressed rage, began to review the footage. He went back to the moment Edward entered the library. The camera showed everything with perfect clarity. Edward taking the clock, Edward approaching Leo in the garden, Edward placing the object in the boy's pocket. The silence in the room was different now. It was the silence before the storm. Edward tried to laugh nervously. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just—" "You were planting evidence to frame a child," Richard said, his voice filled with a fury he hadn't felt in months. "You, my partner of 10 years, tried to destroy the life of a 12-year-old boy for what? To convince me to send them away. Why, Edward? Why are you so afraid of these children?" Edward realized he was cornered. The mask of friendship finally fell, revealing the calculating face behind it. "Because they're waking you up, Richard. You were perfect the way you were. Depressed, vulnerable, signing everything I put in front of you. But these children, they're making you become who you used to be, and I can't allow that." "Why?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because I'm months away from total control of the company," Edward confessed, with nothing left to lose. "A few more signed documents, and it would all be mine. You would be legally out, and I would be the sole owner of everything we built. That you built." He corrected himself with a bitter smile. Helen was shocked. Richard felt the betrayal like a physical stab in the chest. 10 years. 10 years of partnership, of trust, and it was all a lie. "Get out of my house," Richard said calmly. "Tomorrow my lawyers will be reviewing every document you made me sign, every transfer, every contract, and I will reverse everything. And then I will sue you for fraud, for attempted theft, for everything I can." Edward laughed, a humorless sound. "You have no proof of anything beyond today's incident. The documents are legal. You signed everything of your own free will." "Then we'll have to see about that in court," Richard replied. "Now get out before I call the police." Edward cast one last look of hatred at the three boys who had ruined his plans and slammed the door on his way out. As soon as he was gone, Richard turned to Leo, who was still trembling and crying. The boy expected the worst. He expected to be sent away, to be blamed in some way. But Richard opened his arms. "Come here, kid." Leo hesitated, then ran and threw himself into Richard's arms. "I swear I didn't do anything. I would never do that to you, sir." I know, Leo, and I'm sorry for even a second that I doubted you." Matthew and Gabriel joined the hug. The four of them stayed like that for long minutes, a collective embrace that meant so much more than forgiveness. It was acceptance. It was family. Helen watched with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Celia wiped her face with her apron. Even Mr. Takeshi, always discreet, had moist eyes. That night was one of revelations. Richard told the boys about Edward, about the documents, about how they had been the true saviors not just of his legs, but of his entire fortune. If it weren't for them, if they hadn't awakened his attention and care, he would have lost everything without even realizing it. The following days were intense. Richard's lawyers worked tirelessly. They discovered that Edward had embezzled funds, created shell companies, and structured fraudulent transactions. It was a complex and elaborate scheme. Edward would be prosecuted both criminally and civilly. But the deepest impact of that revelation was not legal or financial. It was emotional. Richard, for the first time since the accident, cried. He cried for the betrayal. He cried for the wasted years building an empty empire. He cried for the coldness with which he had treated people. He cried for almost losing the only real thing he had found in so long, the genuine connection with these three children. Helen held him as he wept, and she wept with him. They cried together for the lives they had lived apart, for the distance they had allowed to grow between them, for the lost opportunities. And the boys, Leo, Matthew, and Gabriel, stayed there with them, offering the simple comfort of their presence, of their small hands holding the large ones, of their unwavering faith that everything would be all right in the end. That night something fundamental changed in Richard Thompson. The armor of coldness and cynicism he had built over decades finally cracked and fell away. He recognized with a painful but liberating clarity that the boys had given him back something far more precious than the ability to walk. They had given him back the ability to feel, to trust, to love. In the days that followed, Richard threw himself completely into life with the boys. He followed Leo's lessons, marveling at the boys' intelligence. He sat in the studio with Matthew, discussing colors and shapes, even without understanding anything about art. He listened to Gabriel read passages from the Bible and, for the first time in his life, considered the possibility that maybe there was something bigger than himself in the universe. Helen blossomed. She, who had never had children, was now a mother of 3 at once. She arranged everything to enroll the boys in good schools. Leo would go to a school with a strong STEM program. Matthew would enter a school with a focus on the arts. Gabriel would attend an institution linked to the church that balanced academic and spiritual education. The mansion, once cold and empty, was alive. It had purpose, it had love. It was on a sunny afternoon, in August, 3.5 months after the boys' arrival, that the impossible happened. Richard was in his daily physical therapy session with Leo. The boy was working his legs with his usual dedication when Richard felt something different. "Wait," he said, his voice tense. "Leo, do that movement again." Leo repeated the massage on his right calf, and Richard felt it. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't empty hope. It was real. A clear, defined, undeniable tingling. "I felt it," Richard almost shouted. "Leo, I felt you touch me. I felt it." Leo's eyes widened. "Really? Mr. Richard, are you really feeling it?" "Yes, do it again." Leo touched the leg again, and again Richard felt it. Tears began to roll down his face. "Helen, Helen, come here, quick." Helen came running, followed by Matthew and Gabriel. Richard explained between tears. The boys exploded in shouts of joy. Gabriel fell to his knees and began to thank God aloud. Matthew jumped around the room. Leo, trying to stay calm but failing miserably, laughed and cried at the same time. They called the doctors immediately. Dr. Evans came personally to do an evaluation. After a series of tests, he confirmed it. There was a return of sensation, slight but definitive. It was the first real sign that recovery was possible. "I can't guarantee you'll walk again completely," the doctor warned, "but this is extremely promising. With intensive physical therapy, there's a real chance." "And Leo will be my head physical therapist," Richard declared, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "He got me this far. He'll take me all the way." Dr. Evans smiled. "I've never seen such dedication. This young man has a natural gift. If he wants to pursue this career, I'm sure he'll be exceptional." That night was a celebration. Mrs. Celia prepared a special dinner. They all ate together at the large dining table that had only been used a few times in 15 years of marriage. They laughed, told stories, dreamed of the future. And Richard, looking around the table, seeing Helen smile as she hadn't in years, seeing the 3 boys eating and chatting animatedly, felt a gratitude so deep it almost hurt. These children who had appeared in his life through a hole in the wall had not only promised to make him walk, they had done something much greater. They had taught him the meaning of family, of unconditional love, of second chances. The road ahead would still be long. Richard knew that. But for the first time since the accident, he had real hope. Hope of walking again. Hope of being a better person. Hope of building something genuine with Helen. Hope of being the father that Leo, Matthew, and Gabriel deserved. And in the heart of New York City, in that mansion on the Upper East Side, a new family was being born from the ashes of Richard Thompson's old life. A family built not on blood or convention, but on choice, dedication, and love. The months that followed were a time of intense transformation. The return of sensation in Richard's legs was just the beginning of an arduous but hopeful journey. Dr. Philip intensified the physical therapy sessions, now meeting 6 times a week. Leo continued as the primary assistant, learning increasingly complex techniques and applying them with a dedication that impressed all the professionals involved. September arrived, bringing spring to New York. The trees in the garden bloomed, and with them Richard's life also seemed to blossom again. The sensations in his legs gradually increased. First, it was just tingling. Then came the ability to feel temperature. Next, pressure and touch. And finally, 4 months after the boy's arrival, Richard managed to move the toes on his right foot. That tiny movement, imperceptible to a distant observer, was celebrated as the greatest victory. Helen cried with joy. The boys jumped and shouted. Mrs. Celia baked a special cake. Even Mr. Takeshi, always reserved, gave a big smile and shook Richard's hand firmly. From that moment on, progress was steady. Small movements became larger. Strength returned little by little, muscle by muscle. Richard worked with a determination that surprised even himself. Each physical therapy session was a battle against his own limitations, and he was winning. It was in October, 6 months after the accident and 4 months after meeting the boys, that Richard took his first steps. They were not firm or steady steps. He was wobbly, supported by parallel bars, with Leo on one side and Dr. Philip on the other. But they were steps. His feet touched the ground and supported his weight, and he walked 10 feet that felt like a 10-mile victory. Helen recorded it all on her phone, tears streaming down her face. Matthew and Gabriel applauded and shouted words of encouragement, and when Richard finally stopped, exhausted but triumphant, he looked at Leo and said simply, "You fulfilled your part. Now it's time for me to fulfill mine." That same afternoon, Richard called his lawyers. He wanted to immediately begin the adoption process for the 3 boys. They had already gathered all the necessary documentation, investigated the children's origins. Leo was an orphan. His parents lost to sad but non-violent circumstances when he was 7. He had lived on the streets ever since. Matthew had been abandoned by an addicted mother, who never reappeared. Gabriel was the son of a grandmother who had passed away, leaving him alone in the world. The lawyers explained that the process would be complex. There would be investigations, visits from social workers, hearings at the courthouse. But Richard was prepared. He had all the necessary resources and, more importantly, he had genuine love for these children. Helen became fully involved in the process. She transformed 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor into individual suites for each boy. Leo got a room with a bookshelf full of math and science books. Matthew had his space decorated, with his own artwork and painting supplies. Gabriel received a room with religious symbols he chose personally, including a small oratory where he could say his prayers. Everything seemed to be heading for a happy ending when, in November, the complications began. Edward Morgan, who was being criminally prosecuted for fraud and embezzlement, saw the adoption process as one last chance to get revenge on Richard. His lawyers filed a motion in court alleging that Richard was in a vulnerable condition, that the children had emotionally manipulated him, and that the adoption process was the result of psychological coercion. The accusations were absurd, but they gained some traction in the media. Tabloid newspapers published headlines like "Wheelchair-bound tycoon manipulated by minors" and "Adoption or Scam, the controversial story of 3 street kids." Public opinion was divided. Some defended Richard and the children. Others questioned the true intentions of everyone involved. Edward went further. He hired investigators to find any living relatives of the boys, offering money for them to claim custody of the children. And unfortunately, he found people willing to lie for greed. First, a man appeared claiming to be Leo's uncle, alleging that he had always looked for the boy but could never find him. It was a lie. Leo had never seen the man in his life. Next, a woman emerged claiming to be Matthew's aunt, with an equally fabricated story. For Gabriel, they found a couple who claimed to be distant cousins of his grandparents wanting to rescue the boy. They were all imposters paid by Edward, but technically they had some documentation linking them to the children, however distant the relationship. The court had no choice but to consider their claims. The case grew to proportions no one expected. A court hearing was scheduled where everything would be decided. Richard, Helen, the three boys, the false relatives, Edward and his lawyers, social workers, and even representatives from the district attorney's office would be present. The night before the hearing was tense at the mansion. The boys were scared. What if they were separated? What if they were forced to go with these people they didn't know? Leo, always the strongest, tried to stay calm for his younger brothers, but Richard could see the fear in his eyes. Richard gathered them in the living room and spoke with a conviction that came from the depths of his transformed soul. Listen to me. No matter what happens tomorrow, you are my sons. In my heart, where it really matters, you already are. And I will fight for you with all the strength I have. No one is going to take you from me. I promise. Helen hugged the three of them. We are a family, and families don't get separated. That night, Gabriel prayed more intensely than ever. Matthew drew a portrait of the whole family together. Leo stayed up late studying, because he knew the education Richard had given him would be his best weapon to prove he deserved to be there. The day of the hearing dawned cold and grey. The courthouse was packed with journalists outside and a crowd of curious onlookers. The judge presiding over the case was Judge Margaret Stone, a 50-year-old woman known for her severity, but also for her impartial justice. The hearing began with Edward and his lawyers presenting their accusations. They alleged that Richard, in a state of emotional fragility after the accident, had been seduced by the idea of being healed by the children, that the boys, while not necessarily malicious, were being used by people around Richard to secure access to the family's fortune. They presented witnesses, people Edward had paid to lie, saying they saw the boys behaving suspiciously, talking about money, planning how to get more things from Richard. They were such obvious lies that they were infuriating, but they were being said under oath. Next, the false relatives made their pleas. The supposed uncle of Leo spoke about how he loved the boy and always wanted to care for him. The fake aunt of Matthew cried crocodile tears. Gabriel's cousins acted out a family devotion that was pathetically false. When it was the defense's turn, Richard's lawyers methodically dismantled the accusations. They presented the security camera footage showing Edward planting the clock. They showed the documents proving the financial fraud Edward had committed. They demonstrated that all the witnesses had received suspicious payments from accounts linked to Edward. As for the false relatives, the investigation by Richard's lawyers had revealed the truth. Leo's supposed uncle had a criminal record and had never cared about the boy until contacted by Edward's investigators. Matthew's aunt had completely abandoned that branch of the family decades ago and only returned when offered money. Gabriel's cousins barely knew the boy's grandparents. Then came the most important moment. The personal testimonies. Leo was called first. The 12-year-old boy took the witness stand with an erect and dignified posture. The judge treated him with kindness but seriousness. Leo, tell me how you met Mr. Richard. And Leo told his story. He spoke of life on the streets, of caring for Matthew and Gabriel, of the day they found the hole in the wall and saw the man in the wheelchair. He spoke of the impossible promise, and how they decided to accept the challenge because it was the only hope they had. His voice was clear without hesitation. Do you want to stay with the Thompson family? The judge asked directly. More than anything in the world, Leo replied, tears starting to stream down his face. They're not just rich people who gave us a roof. They gave us love. Mrs. Helen teaches me every day and believes I can be an engineer. Mr. Richard treats me like a real son, not like a charity case. They make me feel like I matter, and I never want to lose that. Leo's supposed uncle tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a look. Matthew was next. The 10-year-old boy, always so communicative, spoke of transformation and second chances, about how everyone deserves the opportunity to start over, about how Richard, who was a closed-off and bitter man, had become kind and loving, about how Helen, who never had children, was the best mother he could imagine. "I know Mr. Richard did bad things in the past," Matthew said with his characteristic wisdom, "but people can change. He changed. And we changed too. We saved each other. That's not manipulation, that's love." Gabriel was the last of the boys. The little one, only 8 years old, held his crucifix and spoke with absolute conviction about faith and miracles, about how God had a plan and had brought them all together for a reason, about how his prayers were answered not just because Mr. Richard started walking again, but because they all found a family. "I don't want to go with those people," Gabriel said, pointing to the false cousins. "I've never seen them in my life. My family is Mr. Richard, Mrs. Helen, Leo, and Matthew, and no one is going to take me from them." Then it was Helen's turn. She took the stand and spoke of the loneliness of her marriage, of how she had lost her purpose in life, of how the boys had given her a reason to wake up every day. She spoke of teaching Leo and seeing his eyes light up with each new concept learned, of sitting with Matthew in the studio and discussing art, of reading to Gabriel and learning from the pure faith of that little boy. "I could never have children," Helen said, her voice breaking, "and I spent years believing my life would always be empty because of it. But then these 3 boys appeared, and I discovered that family isn't about blood. It's about choice, it's about love. I choose these boys, and they chose me too." Finally, it was Richard's turn. He rose from his wheelchair, still needing support, but able to stand, and walked slowly to the witness stand. That simple act, that short but significant walk, said it all. Richard spoke of his old life, of the coldness, the greed, of building an empty empire, of the accident that paralyzed him not just physically but emotionally, of sinking into bitterness and losing any sense of humanity. "And then 3 children appeared in my life," he continued, his strong voice echoing through the courtroom. 3 children who had nothing but offered me everything. They offered me dedication when I didn't deserve it. They offered faith when I had lost all hope. They offered love when I had forgotten how to love." Richard looked at Edward, who was sitting a few feet away. "Edward Morgan, my former partner, is right about one thing. I was vulnerable when these children arrived, but he's wrong to think they manipulated me. The truth is they saved me. They saved me from myself. While he was stealing my money, these children gave me back my soul." The silence in the room was absolute. Richard continued, now looking directly at the judge. "Leo isn't just a smart boy. He is the son I never had and always wanted. Matthew isn't just a talented artist. He is the wisdom I never developed. Gabriel isn't just a child of faith. He is the kindness I never practiced. Together, they made me a better person, and I want to spend the rest of my life being worthy of their love." Tears were running down the faces of many in the room. Even the judge, known for her professional toughness, discreetly wiped her eyes. Edward tried to speak, but his own lawyers stopped him. They knew that any word from him at that moment would only worsen his situation. The judge called for a 2-hour recess to deliberate. It was the longest 2 hours in the lives of everyone involved. Richard, Helen, and the 3 boys stayed together in a private room, holding each other's hands, praying, waiting. When they returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Margaret Stone entered with her usual serious expression. She sat, organized her papers, and began to speak. "I have carefully reviewed all the testimony and evidence presented. The accusations of emotional manipulation are unfounded. The videos clearly demonstrate an attempt at sabotage by Mr. Edward Morgan, who will be referred for additional criminal prosecution for perjury and obstruction of justice." Edward turned pale. His lawyers began whispering frantically. "As for the relatives claiming custody of the children," the judge continued, "the investigations have revealed that none of them have demonstrated any genuine interest or history of care. Their motivations are clearly financial. Therefore, their claims are denied." The false relatives tried to protest but were silenced. And as for the adoption petition of Mr. Richard Thompson and Mrs. Helen Thompson, the judge paused, and everyone's heart seemed to stop. I rarely see a case where the emotional connection and love are so evident. These children have not just found a house, they have found a family. And this family has not just welcomed these children, it has been transformed by them. The judge smiled, the first time anyone had seen her smile in that hearing. Therefore I grant the petition for adoption. Leo Thompson, Matthew Thompson, and Gabriel Thompson. These are now your legal names. You are officially a family. The courtroom erupted in applause. Journalists rushed to make calls, but none of that mattered to the 6 people who embraced in the middle of the room. Richard held his 3 sons with a strength that came from the deepest gratitude. Helen cried and laughed at the same time. The boys shouted with joy. Edward Morgan was escorted out of the courtroom in custody. He would be tried for multiple crimes and face years in prison. But before he left, he looked back one last time and saw Richard with his 3 sons, and in that moment, he understood that he had lost much more than a court case. He had lost the chance to have something real in his life. The following months were of pure joy. The adoption process was officially completed the following January. There was a small ceremony at the mansion, with just the staff, a few close friends, and the lawyers who had fought for the case. Richard's physical recovery continued to progress. By February, he could walk without support for short distances. In March, he walked from the gate to the front door without help. In April, he climbed the mansion stairs alone for the first time since the accident. Leo was enrolled in one of New York's top schools with a focus on STEM. His performance was exceptional. Teachers said he had the potential to get into the best universities in the country. Richard was already planning to help him study engineering at MIT or Caltech. Matthew won a scholarship to a prestigious art school. His works began to attract the attention of galleries. A small exhibition was organized, and all the pieces were sold. The money, Matthew insisted, should be donated to institutions that helped street children. Gabriel continued his spiritual journey. He became an altar boy at the local church and spoke of one day working to help people in need. Helen supported him completely, taking him to church meetings and participating in activities with him. Richard completely restructured his company. He fired executives who shared his old predatory mindset. He implemented policies of social responsibility. He created a scholarship program for vulnerable youth. And he founded a non-profit organization dedicated to getting children off the streets and into welcoming families. Helen found her purpose. She became president of the organization and dedicated hours every day coordinating adoptions, training families, and visiting shelters. Her life, once empty, was now filled with meaning. The marriage between Richard and Helen, which had been dead in all but name, was reborn. They started talking again, laughing together, dreaming of the future. The initial passion might not have returned in the same way, but something deeper and truer took its place. Companionship, respect, genuine love, built on a solid foundation of shared experiences and common purpose. In May, a year after Richard's accident, Edward Morgan was sentenced to 8 years in prison for fraud, embezzlement, perjury, and obstruction of justice. He lost everything he had stolen and still had to pay heavy damages. Richard, to the surprise of many, visited him in prison a few weeks after the sentencing. They sat face to face, separated by glass, speaking through phones. "Why did you come?" Edward asked, bitter and defeated. "Because I learned something important," Richard replied calmly. "I learned that holding on to anger and resentment only poisons the person who carries it. I learned that from 3 children who had every reason to hate the world but chose to love. So I came here to tell you that I forgive you." Edward laughed humorlessly. "Your forgiveness means nothing. It doesn't change where I am." "You're right. It doesn't change where you are, but it changes where I am. And I hope that someday you too will find some form of peace. Not for me, but for yourself." Richard stood to leave, but Edward called him back. "They really changed you, didn't they, those boys?" "Completely," Richard replied. "They showed me it's never too late to start over, to be someone better. I hope one day you learn that too." And with those words, Richard left the past behind for good. Time continued to pass. The boys grew up. Leo developed a passion for robotics and began participating in national competitions. Matthew had a second exhibition, even more successful than the first. Gabriel, with his natural kindness, became the most beloved boy in his school, always helping classmates and teachers. The mansion on the Upper East Side was unrecognizable. Where there was once silence and coldness, there was now laughter and music. Where there were empty corridors, there were now science projects spread out, canvases being painted, books about saints open on various pages. Where there was loneliness, there was now family. Mrs. Celia, who had seen everything from the beginning, commented one morning to Mr. Takeshi as they prepared breakfast. "I never imagined I'd see Mr. Richard like this. Truly happy. And Mrs. Helen too, she looks 10 years younger." Mr. Takeshi nodded with his silent wisdom. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what truly matters." It was on a sunny afternoon in November, exactly a year and a half after the boys' arrival, that the final celebration took place. Richard had fully recovered. He walked normally, without pain or limitation. The miracle that Gabriel had prayed for, that Leo had worked for, that Matthew had sustained with hope, had been fully realized. They organized a party in the mansion's garden. Not a large, ostentatious party, but an intimate gathering with those who truly mattered. Mrs. Celia and Mr. Takeshi were there, of course. Dr. Philip and Dr. Evans were also invited. The boys' teachers came, some true friends who had remained during the difficult times. There were tables with food, soft music playing, simple but beautiful decorations. It was a celebration not just of Richard's physical recovery, but of the emotional recovery of the entire family. At one point in the afternoon, Richard asked for everyone's attention. With Helen by his side and the 3 boys in front of him, he gave a speech that came from the depths of his transformed heart. "A year and a half ago, I was a rich but miserable man. I had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. I was trapped not just in a wheelchair, but in a prison of bitterness and loneliness that I had built myself." He looked at the 3 boys, his eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "And then 3 children entered my life. They literally came through a hole in the wall, and with them they brought something I had lost long ago. Leo brought me dedication and perseverance. Matthew brought me wisdom and hope. Gabriel brought me faith and kindness. Together they not only helped me walk again, they taught me how to truly live." Helen squeezed his hand, smiling through her tears. Richard continued, now looking at her, "And my wife, whom I had neglected for so many years, found through these children the purpose I could never give her. She became the incredible mother she always had the potential to be." Leo, Matthew, and Gabriel approached. Richard knelt to be at their height and hugged all 3. "You saved my life in every possible way, and I promise to spend every day of the rest of my life being worthy of being called your father." Gabriel, always the most emotional, began to cry. Leo tried to maintain his composure but failed. Matthew simply smiled, that wise smile that carried the understanding of all they had been through together. The party continued until sunset. People talked, laughed, shared stories. But at one point, Richard stepped away from the group and walked to the back wall. The hole had been repaired months ago, but he still remembered exactly where it was. He looked at that piece of wall and thought of all the choices and coincidences that had led to this moment. If he hadn't had the accident, if he hadn't become bitter, if he hadn't gone into the garden on that specific afternoon, if the boys hadn't found that hole, if he had sent them away instead of making that absurd promise, so many ifs, so many crucial moments, and they, crucial, had all converged to create something beautiful where there was once only emptiness. "Mr. Richard," a small voice called. It was Gabriel, who had come looking for him. "Are you okay?" Richard picked the boy up, something that would have been impossible a year and a half ago. "I'm more than okay, Gabriel. I'm home." "Because that's it, isn't it? Home isn't a place. It's where your family is," Richard continued, more to himself than to the boy. Gabriel wrapped his arms around Richard's neck. "God answered my prayers. You started walking again. He answered much more than that. He gave me a family. He gave me a purpose. He gave me a second chance." They returned to the party together. Leo was showing his robotics project to Dr. Philip. Matthew was drawing quick portraits of the guests. Helen was laughing at something Mrs. Celia had said. It was a scene of normalcy, of simple joy, of shared love. And Richard Thompson, the man once known for his coldness and ruthlessness, who had built an empire on the unhappiness of others, who had lost everything and found something infinitely more valuable, finally understood the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't in bank accounts, properties, or companies. It was right there in that garden, in those people who chose to love him despite everything. It was in the hugs of his sons, the smile of his wife, the loyalty of his staff, who had become friends. Night fell over New York, the immense city with its millions of stories, and in that mansion on the Upper East Side, one of those stories had found its happy ending. It wasn't a perfect ending, because life is never perfect, but it was a true ending, built on solid foundations of love, forgiveness, and transformation. Leo, Matthew, and Gabriel had promised to make Richard walk again, and they fulfilled their promise so completely that they did much more. They made him live again, and Richard, in turn, had promised to adopt them and give them a new life. And he too fulfilled his promise, giving them not just a roof and food, but a real family, infinite opportunities, and unconditional love. In the end, everyone had won. Everyone had saved each other. And that, more than any medical miracle, was the true story of hope. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Richard, Helen, Leo, Matthew, and Gabriel has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of transformation, redemption, and family love, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it the boy's arrival, the unmasking of Edward, Richard's first step, or the emotional adoption finale? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the most human and transformative side of life. Stories that remind us that it's never too late to start over, that love can heal the deepest wounds, and that family is about choice and dedication. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another narrative that will stir your emotions. Until then,